Wow.
So far my optimism has been proven correct, by the way. I can tell you that at the end of the Cold War, there were so many Western writers that used to say, well, you will see in the 1990s, the Balkans of Asia, which is Southeast Asia, which has far greater diversity of race, language, religion, culture than the Balkans of Europe. They said there'll be war in the Balkans of Asia, but throughout the 1990s, no war in the Balkans of Asia, but war in the Balkans of Europe. See, this shows that actually the impulse towards peace is a very profound and real one.
With China growing bigger and bigger, should Asian countries be threatened by it?
Well, I think they should be concerned about the rise of China. But the good news is that the Chinese government is aware that many of its neighbors are worried about the rise of China. And so the Chinese government has made a very strong and profound effort to share its prosperity with its neighbors. As in, the fastest growing trade flows in the world today are the trade flows in East Asia, and certainly between China and its neighbors. So the number one trading partner for South Korea is China, number one trading partner for Japan is China, and as you know, trade flows between China and India have grown rapidly. So as long as you can create a cooperative fabric, in the region, where we all benefit from China's growth rather than suffer from China's growth, then I don't see that as a problem for the region.
With India not far behind China, and despite the East Asia community, do you see a new regional political configuration shaping up?
Well, I think the rise of India is very good news for this region. And it's like, if you have an aircraft on the runway taking off, China was providing one big engine of growth, and if you have India providing another big engine of growth, then these two big engines, I think, will carry Asia up with them as they go down the runway. And as you know, in the case of Singapore, for example, we have benefited significantly from the growth of China, and we have benefited significantly from the growth of India. And we hope that what Singapore has been able to do can also be done by other Southeast Asian countries. And if you look at the longer history of Southeast Asia, as you know, has been the meeting point of Indian and Chinese civilizations. I mean, if you look at the underlying cultural fabric of Indonesia and Malaysia, the Ramayana, for example, is well known in Java, for example. All that shows how traditional linkages with these two societies that goes back for 2,000 years. Now, these links were cut off by the European colonial period for 200 years or so. Now they're being restored. And I think with the growing awareness of our own common cultural origins, they'll also bring our societies closer together and will also enable economic cooperation to take place also. So I see the rise of India as a plus for the region, together with the rise of China.
How do you see Singapore's future? I mean, it's vis-a-vis its bigger, but not necessarily stronger neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia.
Well, I think they say geography is destiny. Singapore cannot go anywhere except remain in Southeast Asia. So I think Singapore has a vested interest in the prosperity of Malaysia and Indonesia. But it's also a fact, and I'm not giving any big secrets away when I say that Singapore has also had a very troubled relationship with Malaysia, more so with Malaysia than Indonesia, but even with Indonesia as a result of the haze recently, you could see there were some difficulties in the Indonesia-Singapore relationship also. I think the challenge that Singapore has is to convince both Malaysia and Indonesia that Singapore's success is actually going to be a benefit for Malaysia and Indonesia. And if you look at it in economic terms, by the way, if you want to get access to markets, let's say markets, a flower market, for example, in Holland, right? If you have a very efficient logistical hub in Singapore, it creates enormous opportunities for all kinds of industries in Malaysia and Indonesia to connect with the rest of the world. Now, developing an efficient logistical hub requires a lot of investment, requires a lot of technology, requires a lot of modern management. And why reinvent the wheel, you know? I mean, in the developed countries, when you have an efficient city, for example, that efficient city is seen not as a parasite, but as an economic asset. I mean, New York City helps to promote growth to all cities around, to all the neighborhood around it. London promotes growth to all the regions around it. It's not a zero-sum game. So Singapore's success doesn't come at the cost of its neighbors, but Singapore's success actually adds economic value to its neighbors. Now that kind of what I call modern rational thinking, which has propelled the West ahead, is what we need to see in this region. But it's very hard to explain that sometimes, you know, to people, because they keep thinking that if Singapore is growing and prospering, it must be because it is, in a sense, at the expense of its neighbors. And that's not the case at all.
Let me ask you a question that I think is a problem common among a lot of countries. I mean, even if it doesn't exist physically in Singapore, the threat is there, and that's about terrorism, the scourge of many countries in Asia. How should this problem be addressed, in your opinion?
Well, I think it needs to be addressed at two levels, okay? First, I think you need to fight terrorism brutally, okay? Because, I mean, the terrorists do not believe in compromise, okay? So if there's a terrorist threat, you must suppress it, you must combat it. That military dimension has to be done. But that's only one part of the picture. The other part of the picture is to ensure that the terrorist organizations do not get new recruits, you know. Because as Rumsfeld said once, you know, he's not sure whether he's killing more terrorists than they're being recruited. So you have to find out what are the underlying causes that lead people to join these terrorist organizations and deprive them of that. And that's why, for example, I think the growth of these jihadist movements is bad for all of us. I mean, Indonesia, frankly, has suffered more from jihadist explosions than Singapore has, for example. But to stop these movements from growing, you also have to address some other issues, take care of the political problems that fuel these movements. And this is where, frankly, the West needs to cooperate more with us in terms of understanding the root causes of this terrorism and finding ways and means of addressing them.